Hello and welcome back to the Cybersock podcast with me, Adam.
And me, Ryan.
To continue from last week, we had a lot of positive reactions. We went in a new direction. And I'd like to continue by going in another new direction. This time it's a surprise for Ryan what's happening.
Okay.
I've collated 23 hot takes in the programming world. I've scoured the internet for these. There was some bad ones that we're not going to include, and some may yet be too hot for the pod. We're going to go right off the bat.
Okay.
Copy and paste should be forbidden. You should never be able to copy and paste in your code.
I can see the thought behind this hot take. There is an argument there, I think, isn't there? Because when you're learning a new framework or tool or language, it makes sense to write things more manually when you're learning something. I would say sometimes agree, sometimes disagree. It depends on the situation.
Yeah, I find the majority of my copying and pasting is actually within the code base. I will just navigate somewhere where I've done something similar before or seen something similar and grab the code and modify it slightly.
I suppose it depends a lot, I guess, on the framework. Some frameworks make it very easy to understand what's happening, whereas with others you might want to do something a bit more obscure that would require a copy and paste.
Yeah, sometimes it's an obscure issue that you've not seen before. Like config files, I just copy and paste because you only use it once. Only knowing one language, no matter how well you know that language, does not make you a good programmer.
So this person is saying you should learn more than one to be a good programmer.
Yes, so rather than spending all your time becoming an expert, it's better to be a jack of all trades.
Is it? Because I kind of feel like that's not the opinion that is held in society, really. Society prefers specialists to someone who can sort of work their way around everything.
I think this is a fairly mild take, I agree with, because you kind of make yourself irrelevant quite quickly if you only know one thing. You limit what you can do.
I would not say irrelevant, Adam. You can make it easily through life knowing one language. Can you become a better programmer by learning more than one? Yes, you'll learn the quirks of another language and how to do things in other ways as well. I think there's a benefit to learning other languages, but I wouldn't say that if you only know one that you're a bad programmer. A lot of people only know one.
Interesting. Simply 3 words, performance does matter. We've discussed this, I think, in a previous podcast. We've thought that performance doesn't really matter when it comes to development.
I think when you're talking about on the granular level, if something is milliseconds faster than something else, what does it matter? What does it matter? It's still going to be fast enough. Do we always need to aim for absolute optimal performance? Or can we be satisfied with enough?
Yeah, this is an interesting point. I think it's all about the requirements that you set, right? It needs to be good enough for users to be able to use it without hating it. But any more than that is wasted effort, probably.
Maybe you have a requirement that it needs to be, ultra performant for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then you can, work that into what you're making. But is performance like the ultimate thing we should be aiming for? I don't think so. Performance matters, but there's other things that should be considered as well.
Nice, I like it. Unit tests don't need to be written up front and sometimes don't need to be written at all. So the arguments for this is if you're writing unit tests, it can force you to write your code in a different way to how you might write it otherwise. You might overly functionize it to make it easily testable. And also a really good unit test takes a while to make and is quite brittle to any changes in the code base.
It shouldn't be brittle, though.
I don't think I agree with this. I think they're probably quite disillusioned with unit testing, but I don't think it's that bad. I think if you can overdo it, probably.
I mean, I think you can take this either way, and either way is fine. I don't feel like I have a strong opinion on this. Before or after, as long as you have tests, I don't mind which way round you do it, as long as there are tests.
I think it's depending on the way you write the tests as well. I think the tests you write beforehand should be not implementation-based, but result-based. I want this to happen. So it's a very broad unit test. This result needs to occur. I don't care how.
It should always be in that way, though, right? Because then you can refactor, and it's fine. As long as you have the same result out, then the unit test will pass.
I think this person doesn't do that with their unit tests and they test each function's implementation. I think that's wrong. frameworks and libraries should be a last resort.
Well, that's incredibly spicy. A last resort, I would say they should be a first resort. Why would you want to make more work for yourself by implementing everything from scratch? You're reinventing the wheel by not using a framework or library.
They argue that there are limitations to frameworks and libraries that you don't know until you get to certain points down the line.
Surely, if there's limitations in the framework, you can usually work your way around them. I feel like that's a cop-out answer to that. I've never had an issue in a framework where I felt like I'm stuck now, unable to do what I want to do. As someone who's made apps in frameworks and in not frameworks, I would never recommend making something without a framework. It's much harder. You make a lot more work for yourself. It takes longer. It's potentially less secure. The code is harder to understand, especially for other developers that come onto the project. If you use a framework, they'll be very familiar with the structure of your code and how things are laid out in your project. If you make a project without a framework, they're going to have no idea what's going on.
This is probably from the kind of person that thinks that abstraction is bad. Not being able to understand the nuts and bolts of how these things work means that you shouldn't be using it. That's a point of view I think I disagree with.
I think that's a amateur opinion to have that thought, because you're not seeing the value of a framework. And think of every open source framework, there's like hundreds of maintainers who probably know more than you.
Let's get on to the next one. Most best practices in engineering are to limit the damage that can be done by bad devs.
I think you should be following best practices, even if you're working on your own and you're not considering having anyone else work on the project as well.
Yeah. I think the idea that it limits the damage done by so-called bad devs is quite elitist. I think it actually limits the damage that can be done by everyone, right? You included. Everyone makes mistakes, and having these practices that stop you making these mistakes is helpful.
Yeah, you included is an important point, because considering things like maintainability and readability and things like that, that also applies to you, not just when you're making things for other developers to read and understand. If you write something and you come back to it in a month, if you've not followed best practices, you might find that very hard to understand.
I think this probably comes from someone who's fed up with all these rules and procedures they have to follow when they're thinking, well, I can just do it myself, I know what I'm doing. And I think that's probably a dangerous point of view, because how do you know what you're doing?
Yeah.
Next, the more process you have, the worse your code base becomes. So process like code reviews, unit testing, code standards, they limit the creativity any one developer can bring to the process.
It increases the complexity of everything when you add a lot of process to your project. There's a sweet spot, right? Where you don't have tremendous amounts of process, where it's really hard to make any changes to the project, but also to a point where you're ensuring best practices, things like linting, and your tests are running and everything's been reviewed. There's a nice sweet spot there in the middle, I think.
Yeah. I think it's kind of following on from that last point. It feels like someone was very irritated with having to do all these things that they view as unnecessary.
Surely that's a lot of what these hot takes are, though, right?
Yeah, I'm just trawling the internet for angry people. Not everything needs its own method. One method can do more than one thing.
Yeah, it can.
I think we're taught a lot that that's bad practice.
It depends, I think, how you name your methods, and that's something I value very highly as well.
Yeah.
On that readability front. I think it is nice to separate out methods, but you don't want to take it too far, really. Personally, I find that I will draw methods out into other new methods if I feel that they will be reused. It's rare that I'll draw out a method just for the purposes of readability, because sometimes it can make it less clear. You have to look further inside to see the implementation details. It's a balance, as is everything in software engineering.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I've certainly found that as well. Every defect you find, not just the most important ones, should be deleted when you first see it.
I think this is me. Whenever there's a problem, I want it fixed immediately. Even if it's little, because it affects the quality of the entire project if it's just full of bugs that no one's fixing.
Yes. I think that the counter argument is probably, if something's good enough, get on with actually producing things the client wants.
If it's full of issues, then that is not enough.
I suppose if the text is maybe bold and that shouldn't be bold somewhere, or maybe a method is calling a method too many times and it's a bit slow. It works, right? It's not a critical issue. The client doesn't really care.
That example there, what are we talking? Like a 5-second job? If that. So why wouldn't you fix something that can just improve the quality of the entire project?
I think it'd be a cost-benefit analysis you'd have to look at quickly and just think, well, is it worth my time to fix this?
I will always fix things like that. Why not?
Why not? It's okay not to be a rock star programmer, to just have it as a job, not care that much about it.
I think I am a bit of a rock star programmer. It's my life. But it's absolutely fine for it to just be your work and for you to not be interested in it outside of work. There's absolutely no problem with that. That's reality for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of social pressure on people to be obsessed with programming and code, to read when they're out of work about this, to listen to podcasts about it, to code on their own time.
Yes. You see a lot of people who would kind of be in shock at you not working on a side project or not having something to do in your own time. People can have other hobbies that isn't programming.
Yeah.
And there's no problem with that.
There would be no other industry where that's maybe a side design. No one's expecting you to go and be a miner in your free time. Yeah, I dig holes in my backyard for fun.
Yeah. I think for a lot of software engineers or programmers, that because it kind of starts out as a hobby, then they still have it as a hobby when they're working in the software world. That's not comparative to other areas. It's not like you see a lot of lawyers who, when they were younger, said law was their hobby. But you get a lot of software engineers where programming was their hobby when they were younger.
It's very accessible.
It's not exactly the same to compare it to other jobs, I think, because programming can be a hobby.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. A degree in computer science does not teach you to be a developer.
Well, I think I've improved so much by having a degree in computer science. Would I say you have to have one? No. But if you saw someone who didn't have a degree and then an exact replica of that person who had a computer science degree, I would prefer the person who had the degree.
Would you?
Yeah.
I think it's more important to have a good amount of experience. I wouldn't trust someone who understands the theory of law but has never walked in a courtroom as opposed to someone who's been in a courtroom for 20 years.
Yes, but I'd want someone with experience who also understands theory, because there is a benefit to that, rather than just someone who has, say, street smarts of having that experience, but no actual understanding of why things happen or the more academic side of it.
I think that's interesting. I have a corollary take in here that a CS degree actually makes you a more well-rounded programmer because it shows your commitment to the cause. You've done it for 3 years beforehand.
I agree with that, and not just on the commitment side, because you will just learn things in those 3 years that will make you a better developer. That if you'd just studied in your own time or been on like Udemy or the likes to learn programming, you're not going to learn as much as you will over 3 years at a university.
Interesting. Yeah, I think there are some areas that are beneficial in that it shows you things you might not see. If you're looking to learn programming, you might not look at design patterns. That wouldn't come up in a how to make a web app tutorial.
No.
But I don't think it's hugely more beneficial. If there were 2 people who did and didn't go to uni, but who spent the same amount of time developing, I think they'd be fairly similar in their abilities.
I'd still prefer the one who had the theory understanding, though.
Yeah. Don't comment. Comments get stale. They are overlooked by people when they're reading through. They are often obvious. You should write why you did something, but other than that, your code should be self-documenting.
Yes, I can get behind this idea. That's not how I am in real life. I like when on the top of a method, when you describe how it's used and what it returns. I think it makes it clearer when you're looking through the code to understand what things are for and how they work. The only time I would add one into like the code itself, not above methods, is if I've written something that's particularly difficult to understand. So maybe I've got an if statement that's not immediately obvious what it means. It's nice to put just a little line just to explain what it means in English words, in real terms. You just want to make things as easy to understand as possible.
I think that's reasonable. Sometimes an explanation of the implementation can be unnecessary. It's more interesting to write about the goals of what you're trying to do. This function should do this. It's not this if statement checks this variable against this variable, and if this is the case, it does this.
Yes, you wouldn't want one on every line. Most of the time, you should aim to write your code in a way that is understandable without comments, which is what I try to aim for.
I think developers don't tend to over-comment. It is rare that you see something with lots and lots of comments. It's much more common you see something with not enough comments. Cool. It's okay to write garbage code occasionally.
I mean, I write it sometimes, but is it okay? No.
If you think of agile principles, working code over all else, right? The user just wants their thing to work. They don't care how. It's a black box.
Yes, that's something that matters to the developer.
If you're just providing a website for Greg, who does a carpentry business, and he just wants to show off his little wooden ducks, writing some terrible code for that website doesn't really matter.
I suppose as long as it works, but strive for better, as you'd say.
Yeah. Your job is to put yourself out of work. Your code should be easily picked up by other people. If you collapsed one day, there should be no issues for the company to replace you.
You should write your code in a way that it's not only writable by you, other people should be able to work on it as well with no problem. I agree.
Okay.
What do you think?
I think it's an interesting point. Some developers do the opposite. They enjoy having their fiefdoms, that only they know how it's working, and if something goes wrong, they have to be called. You know, they can't be gotten rid of. And I don't think it makes you easier to replace as much as it makes you more valuable to the company.
That makes you a better software engineer.
Readability in your code matters more than correctness.
That seems nonsense to me.
So if you have code that doesn't quite do what it's supposed to do but is very readable, that's preferable to code that does exactly what it's needed to do but can't be understood.
I mean, surely the code always needs to do what it needs to do. Otherwise, why is it there if it's not doing what it should be doing? That seems silly. However, readability should be highly valued. And I love when I see what someone else has written and it's highly readable. I really enjoy that as another developer.
You could argue that if it's incorrect and readable, it's much easier to fix than if it's correct, not readable, when you want to change it in some later date.
Right.
Other developers would hate you less if it's readable.
Well, thank you, Adam, for taking me through some hot takes today and seeing which ones I agreed with and did not agree with. I quite enjoyed doing that.
Yeah, I enjoyed finding these on the internet. They're some interesting people. A lot of opinions that I left out were much more extreme.
I think it is mostly about finding that sweet spot in the middle and not heading towards the extreme on either end.
Yeah.
Such as in life again. I feel like I say that a lot, but you can relate a lot of software engineering to life.
Yeah. Be nuanced in your development life.
Right, should we wrap it up there?
I think that was good. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Goodbye.